Welcome to Emergent Voices, Reintegration and Assistance from the Perspectives of Formerly Criminal Justice Advisors. I'm Dr. Linda Williams. I'm your presenter and the researcher on the project. Introduction. We'll discuss this presentation comes in 4 parts. First, we'll discuss the problem statement. We'll discuss the methodology, data collection, instrumentation, and analysis of the research. We'll also discuss the results. And finally, we'll discuss the conclusions and statement of the problem. From 1974 to present, we have seen in the 30 years between 74 and 2014, a prison population increase of 500%. We've increased criminal justice spending by 487.5% just between 82 and 2006. And between 1972 and 2009, we failed to decrease or deter crime by virtue of these initiatives. Between 72 and 2009, we've only seen a 0.3% decrease in crime reduction. So let's discuss a little bit of the history of these criminal justice initiatives, going back to beginning with Richard Nixon.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive, dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had. If we're going to have a successful offensive, we need more money. In order to defeat this enemy, which is causing such great concern, and correctly so, to so many American families, money will be provided to the extent that it is necessary and to the extent that it will be useful.
The interesting thing about Nixon's initiatives is that he did take a multi-pronged approach. He did bring it under right directly into the front office in the White House to oversee the initiative. But we didn't begin to see a major increase in prison population until decades later. The Comprehensive Crime Control Initiative of 1984 spearheaded that multiple exponential increase in prison population because it increased the federal penalties for cultivation, possession, and transfer of marijuana. At the same time, it also increased the amount of time that you would have to spend if under a conviction for these crimes. The Anti-Drug Act of 1988 came under Reagan, and it established the new offenses, sanctions, and determinate sentencing legislation that resulted in an increase in the prison population, but it also resulted in tying the hands of judges and reduce it, if not totally eliminating their discretion with respect to sentencing. They had to follow these sentencing guidelines regardless of whether their judicial discretion told them that maybe a lesser term would be more appropriate for the individual. The Federal Anti-Crime Act, which came under William Jefferson Clinton, provided financial initiatives to states that implemented the recommendations of the Commission as previously discussed. All of this failed to deter crime. All of this increased criminal justice costs, and more offenders were incarcerated for longer terms. In March of 2014, we began to see that the U.S. Attorney General announced $173 million for criminal justice reform. It was called Smart on Crime Initiative. And under it, many nonviolent offenders would return to their.
The statistics cannot be ignored. So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. Every year, we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. But here's the good news. I've commuted the sentences of dozens of people sentenced under old drug laws that we now recognize were unfair. And yesterday I announced that I'm commuting dozens more.
President Barack Obama was the first president in decades to leave office with a federal prison population lower than when he took office. Obama granted early release to 46,000 nonviolent prisoners. Prior to leaving office, an additional 1,927 were granted clemency, but here's the deal. All of those released prisoners returned to their communities. Whether these prisoners were prepared to reintegrate on any level from developmental to socioeconomic, these prisoners were released back into their communities. The purpose of this study. There are several purposes of this study. First, to explore the perspectives of formerly incarcerated individuals who have successfully reintegrated. To understand from their perspectives the turning points that facilitated their decisions to desist from criminal activity. And to offer knowledge that may augment existing existing reentry programs, to increase a reduction in recidivism for these programs, and to facilitate sustained reintegration success for individuals reentering their communities. Significance of the study includes there appear to be 2 ignored areas of reintegration research. There's a lack of focus on turning points in an individual's decision to desist from criminal activity, and there's a failure to acknowledge the implications of human agency in desistance decisions. Another issue that's addressed in this research is the fact that most measure recidivism at the 3-year to 5-year marks. There was one study participant in another research project that said too many people rely on treatment. If you don't develop a sense of who you are, then no program in the world is going to help. The reintegration methodology that exists today traditionally is founded on rational choice theory. It kind of relies on the social control focus interventions, the carrot, and the reward. If you don't act right, you're gonna get these consequences. It kind of results in status offenses and violations that often constitutes grounds for reincarceration. So if you get a technical violation, some kind of probation requirement that you didn't meet, you're generally sent back to prison for that. It's considered recidivism. It has a negligible impact on reducing recidivism, in other words. Reintegration programs and recidivism, 67.8% of participants were reincarcerated within 3 years of release. Within 5 years, 76.6% were rearrested. Now, of those, 56.7% were rearrested in the first year. Reoffenses occurred within 21 months of release. So the research gap we're attempting to address in this research is existing research tends to overlook the implications of human agency, self-determination, personal choice, individual control over decision making, and the degree to which they influence successful or unsuccessful reintegration. The emergent interactive agency model of social learning theory is the foundation for the analysis of the data that was collected under this research. It kind of focuses on autonomous agency, mechanical agency. They're not mutually exclusive, but they work in tandem. Self-determination is an emergent dynamic that research is looking at how developmental considerations might affect how many times an individual does recidivate prior to making a final desistance decision. So it's a progression depending upon many factors, including developmental factors. An individual may go back to prison 2 or 3 times before they finally desist. And I think that our mindset now in reintegration is it's a bad thing, of course, if you desist, but everybody's expecting you to jump out of your situation prior to prison into prison, which is kind of a behavioral deep freeze where many do not tend to address their underlying issues. So now you're thrown back into society not having dealt with the underlying causes of your desistance decisions, and then you're expected to do better just by virtue of the fact that you were locked up in this so-called deep freeze. Data collection involved, again, social cognitive theory, indicating that the emergent interactive model would be more appropriate to looking at the life course desistance decisions of the participants. Bandura's research, it was groundbreaking, and he's seen a lot in the analysis and evaluation of the data in this study. He said any account of the determinants of human action must include self-generated influences as a contributing factor. This is an action research project. It focuses on the best in people. We want to look at their strengths, employ a systematic inquiry to determine what those strengths are. It seeks to strengthen the restorative justice system's capacity to achieve heightened potential, and it facilitates a strength-based understanding of reintegration from the perspective of successfully reintegrated individuals. So the data collection involved online surveys of formerly incarcerated individuals, and this survey included inclusive, exclusive criteria, and of course informed consent. And then those who met the necessary criteria for the study as pre-established, met all the inclusive criteria, underwent a semi-structured telephone interview. It included 7 open-ended questions. The interviews were recorded. The interviews were described and coded. We also, in the interest of context, conducted online interviews including informed consents, and the online surveys of the current or formerly parole or probation officers had several open-ended questions that were later coded and evaluated. Of course, the researcher maintained a field journal with notes and observations throughout. At a limited sample, we did use non-randomized convenience sampling for the formerly incarcerated individuals. Again, they were between the ages of 35 and 74, had served time in federal and state prisons in the United States. The most recent release date had to be honored before 2009. For the parole and probation officer group, non-randomized convenience sampling, current or former parole and probation officers Group 1, former individuals. The sample included 4 participants between the ages of, as indicated, 35 and 74. They were out of prison between 20 years and 23 years. The female participant had a total of 4 incarcerations before desisting. 1 male participant had been reincarcerated 3 times. 1 male had been reincarcerated 2 times, and another participant had a total of 2 incarcerations. So the average reincarceration rate for all 4 of the formerly incarcerated participants was 2.72. Current and former probation officers. They reported from everywhere from Connecticut to Florida to Michigan. They had an average of 6 to 16 years they had been in their fields of expertise. So all of the coding of all of the interviews and all of the interview transcripts were divided into personal, behavioral, and environmental sections according to Behaviorist triarchic reciprocal causality model. These were the major categories for coding, which of course we went through numerous. You did the minor coding, then the major coding, and then finally everything was placed under these categories for both group 1 and group 2. For the formerly incarcerated individuals, the results show that they place greater emphasis at 69% on personal and behavioral competencies, 31% on environmental, 38% on behavioral, and 31% on personal. Current and former parole and probation officers put 17% importance on behavioral, 50% on personal, 67% on personal, behavioral, and environmental, and time management, planning, goals, and education under personal behavior was 100% important to these particular. Further research should use a stratified sample to facilitate a greater understanding of developmental influences on the desistance decisions of formerly incarcerated individuals. It should also identify cognitive implications at each stage of the desistance process and identify the triarchic influences at play at each stage of the criminal desistance trajectory. Now, research should take a developmental criminological view of reintegration and measure participant outcomes from a holistic framework that includes personal, behavior, and environmental aspects of the. Future research should also consider developmentally distinct aspects of the participants. Should consider turning point related to the desistance from criminal activity. They should also consider the implications of human agency in the desistance decisions across the life course. Research should include consistent consideration of participant-specific qualitative data at each stage of the quantitative analysis. It should analyze self-determinate psychodynamic shifts that emerge from the participant narratives as it likely lend itself to aggregation because these narratives and this qualitative data does not necessarily lend itself to aggregation like quantitative data does. But it's an important aspect of fleshing out a more holistic view of the quantitative analysis. Don't focus on recidivism as a measurement of program success. Place some emphasis on developmental and life course implications in individualized intervention planning. Consider developmental and life course progression of the individual participant. Community advocacy and criminal justice policy should abandon rational choice-based restorative justice models that are based on a punitive deficiency and control paradigm. And they should adopt an appreciative, opportunistic view that takes into account the perspectives of reintegrating individuals.